because this came to me in prayer. I had spent some time prayerfully, because that's how I do things, reading through kind of a lectio divina, I think of it as, the early scriptures, the various traditions, the ancient Egyptians across, to the oracle bones in China, the whole works all the way back as far as I could go. And then praying about all of that, it came to me in prayer, start Theology Without Walls. That this was a kind of upshot, that the whatever the divine or ultimate reality is, it seemed to be present in multiple traditions. And I've actually shared the transcript of that prayer, what I had put in prayer and the kind of what came to me as I verbalized it, with Francis Clooney. And he gave me the good advice: don't share this with anybody else. Okay. Though I know he had told me when he got the offer to go to Harvard, which you think any academic would snatch up, he had to go pray and see if this is what God wanted him to do. So that was one reason I felt comfortable sharing it with him. However, I quickly saw that we're in an institutional context with scholars and intellectuals, and you have to give an argument. You can't say, it came to me in prayer. I'm Jerry. It came to me in prayer that we should have a theology without walls. And what came to my attention, I had not, for a long time, most of my life, I was a happy agnostic. And I'd had a religious interest for only less than 10 years, I guess, when I started reading all these ancient texts. And but I looked around, well, what's going on in religion? And I saw, oh my God, the walls are coming down already. And one of the things you see, that's true in many ways, but some of them are just the things you mentioned, Rita. What are the things relevant to theology? One of the questions that Chris Denny had prepared beforehand is, what makes TWW theological? Given that it's not, we understand Christian theology and Hindu theology and so forth. Why is this even theology if we're drawing in everything? Philosophy, literature, science? Well, it depends on where you think the insights into the ultimate reality can be found. And my own view is those insights can be found many places. First of all, in other religions, comparative theology had shown that, had demonstrated it, you might say. And once you discover that, to my mind, it doesn't make sense to say, however, I'm just going to do my theology. And as Robert Neville sometimes says, oh, well, then that's just sociology. You're reporting, this is what my people believe. Okay, that's a datum. But if you're going to actually take in all the evidences, all the information you have about the ultimate, you can't just study your own tradition, and you can't rule things out because they happen not to fit your tradition. That's what they call confirmation bias, And I'll give one thing that struck me as I read, I thought it's a tribute to Clooney's spiritual openness. He's a fine, fine scholar and reader, but his own spiritual openness is that sitting in a quiet Hindu temple opposite a statue of the goddess, I'm forgetting now which one, suddenly there was something real there, he reports. And he was aware. He's looking at her, she's looking at him. This is Darśan. And he said, I might have worshipped her, but I'm a Catholic and we don't worship goddesses. Now I know my own reaction would have been, wow, I've got to add this to my arsenal of truths, my personal library of truths.
So Jerry,
has to include this.
Can I ask you a question? Could we take Theology Beyond Walls and its approach, as you just explained, to this is part two of my question. Can we approach it in two ways? One is there's too much information. We need to take all of this into account, or we're just, engaging in confirmation bias, as you said. And therefore, I need to leave my box and need to not have boxes. I need to be out there in the light. And I remember giving in a Unity church, I was asked to give a sermon, and I gave the sermon on windows. And I showed all of these beautiful windows. I said, these are all the different religions. And as you can see, even though we're looking at the same sky, our view of it is very different depending on the window. But then, there's mysticism. And then I showed a picture of someone standing on the beach with no window. And
right.
right in the midst of reality. So this, to me, is what Theology Without Walls is telling us, that go to the beach or just get out of the house. Go stand on the lawn. That's what you need to do. Don't look out the window. But is it possible that you can do that? And still, you brought up Clooney, and this is so important because Hindus have been very offended by that statement of Frank's, although they love him, okay? But they're very offended by that because they're thinking from a Hindu mind that the Hindu would immediately say, oh, it's Mother Mary, I'm going to worship her, and would subsume her under the broader rubric of Brahman. Because since God is infinite, God has infinite ways of connecting in communion with you. And the Hindu concept of a place of worship is not a congregational space, it's a consecration space. It's been consecrated to be in special communion with the divine, and this is what you're feeling. So Frank then steps back, which I understand. But the question is, can you go outside, understand, come back into your window, polish it, and say, I know what's out there, but I'm going to stay with my window because it's beautiful?
Well, you can do that. I mean, we know many cases of people doing that. However, is the real question, I think, is there another possibility? There are all kinds of good reasons. This image of walls you can get carried away with it. It's not, we're not, at least I'm not, and I don't think the project is like anti-establishmentarian, trying to tear something down. When I looked at the world, I thought the walls are coming down already, but without anything reflective, thoughtful to put in their place. And so that's a great need. It's a cultural need. It's a need it's a theological need. As soon as you're aware that there's more than one source of insight, then I see no reason at all. This happens, in fact, all the time in the history of religion, the history of other intellectual projects. You bring in information into the walls, if you like. You do have windows, and if you don't like talk about walls, windows is a wonderful image, but it does mean, I guess I like walls because sometimes it's good actually not just to look through the windows, but to wander around, to go visit. And of course, this increasingly happens in our age of global transportation, that people go and they spend serious time in various traditions, various cultures, not just traditions, because you get insights just from a whole cultural immersion. Everyone who does study abroad knows that. You spend that time, wow, they do these things very differently, but you can bring those insights back in. And I don't see any reason that we have it already happening. Not only churches accommodated Darwin, and Marx has a big influence, liberation theology, all these things come in and they're accommodated because the religious frames are enormously flexible. And it's often not felt they are. And of course, some more fundamentalist types think they shouldn't be flexible, but in fact they are historically, and the fundamentalists are usually wrong about the history. They're not defending how it used to be, they're making up how it used to be. So this is entirely possible. I know churches and synagogues where they have a lecture series, bring in people to talk about the other religions, bring in people from the other religions, and saying, okay, we're in our tradition. Now, what do we make of this? And how do we learn from it? And I know one church locally, I spoke there, their official purpose is they mainly have certain well-known Western traditions, but their purpose is to support each other in their spiritual journeys. Each person has a spiritual journey. Some go out, as you described, Rita, and you might say to the lone beach and may have a powerful mystical type experience. Others don't have that. They have something else. They go work in the soup kitchens and help people, who are poor. That's true too. Dorothy Day, who's now a saint, did that sort of thing. And so I guess I see that as the urgent relevance of Theology Without Walls, not just because that's going on culturally, but because this enables us to have a better understanding of the divine or ultimate reality than we had when we were within our boxes, as you put it, Rita. And why wouldn't that be desirable for any person with spiritual or religious impulses? But you haven't said anything, Chris. What's on your mind?
So I sent you a few minutes ago some questions that I'd come up with, and I want to start there because you mentioned Frank Clooney at the very beginning of your origin story, and I'd like to sort of ask you to explain what you see as the difference between Theology Without Walls and comparative theology. And not to get too crass here, but talking about possibilities for influence, do you see TWW as better positioned than comparative theology at this particular moment in time in society at large and in the religious world?
Well, how are they different? And I think my story about Clooney and the goddess shows a lot about how they're different. As far as I can tell, the comparative theology, there's been enormous, wonderful work, and I have put on the TWW website a kind of tribute to the model of comparative theology because of its enormous advantages for the conduct of scholarship and communication and institutional relationships, personal identity, so forth. It has it has exemplars. Almost every big movement, Copernicus came along. Anybody could criticize epicycles. You needed Copernicus to come along and give us a new world system, as I guess Galileo called it. But and Clooney has done that. He's given the most exemplary work of that kind you can imagine. However, I have the feeling, for me, the subject matter of theology is the divine or ultimate reality. And I don't see on the whole, I could be mistaken, there may be dramatic things I'm not aware of, but I don't see on the whole that there's been kind of theological breakthroughs, that we've had people in one tradition saying, oh, I used to think such and such, but now my mind is opened in this much wider way. I mean, that's what you would, in a way, hope to happen. And as I see it, as I was sort of saying, it's almost like a dialectical logic that once you engage in serious comparative theology, you see there are these truths in other traditions. And to me, saying I'm a Catholic, I can't go there, doesn't make sense. Now, I realize people have their own traditions, their own life commitments, their own vows even, and I respect that. That's their choice. That's fine. However, to me, it's not compelling that if you want the most adequate understanding of reality, that you're going to say, well, no, I've got this or that creed, this or that thing I'm attached to. I'm just not going to give standing to the other things.
Thanks. Thank you.
So it's kind of dialectically self-refuting. I'm also aware Well, now you asked the question about influence, something I was aware of at the beginning, you know, in my own sense of in the history of ideas and culture, things have a kind of time. They come to a certain fulfillment or then an impasse. They've done what they can do, and now the question is what next? And they can't just keep on doing the same old thing once they've had certain insights and breakthrough. But I felt TWW was in some ways premature, that people have still steps to go through in in their own religiosity as well as their theological thinking. And you don't do that instantly by saying, oh, Jerry Martin has an argument, therefore, I'm going to be radically different from what I was before. That's not how anything works. I was aware from the beginning, and I think we're beginning to see it at panels and in the new publication series, when what I think it was younger, they all always chronologically young, but a different generation. TWW, I went out and got the senior people because that would put us on the map. People like Robert Neville and Mark Heim, and even Clooney was willing to be helpful as a kind of friendly critic, and Wesley Wildman, John Thetominal, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that generation tends to be wedded to the idea that the relevant data are the religions, and you're trying to figure out what to make of the religions as a constellation, you might say. And I've said this over and over, but you know, it's hard for it to register with people. No, the subject matter is not the religions. The data in question are not the religions. It's the revelations, the enlightenments, the insights, the epiphanies. Those are the data. And you find them recorded in the text, so we can go study the text. They're recorded in life, so we can go study worship and talk to people and ask about their spiritual journeys. And of course, many have left witness of that. So you have Saint Teresa, Ramakrishna, and so forth. And you'll learn from those. And so in an open-ended way. And so that's really the difference. And if you ask about influence, well, I never thought about influence. Influence obviously is important in the movement of ideas in culture. Some things just sort of die on the vine, and maybe look to some scholar later, oh, that was a good idea, but somehow it didn't go anywhere. Or occasionally there are exogenous events like what happened to the Zoroastrians. They had Alexander the Great march through, and then a few centuries later, the Muslims marched through, and once major religion is just people huddling together as remnants of that tradition. So those things happen too. But if you ask about, it's hard to predict influence, but if you ask a slightly different question that's relevant to influence, is what is relevant now? What is pertinent to people now? Well, I think TWW is pertinent. I almost think of forward-looking theology versus retrospective theology. Often you look at a standard Lutheran theologian, well, it looks like kind of retrospective theology. Okay, we can go back and go through Luther's writing and Melanchthon, all these characters. And I guess Karl Barth kind of did a revival of that tradition in a fairly orthodox mode. But that seems like, as I say, rather retrospective. And the young people, it was part of the challenge. Is why I wrote that little commendment for comparative theology, is there was one of those, which foundation does it, Lilly or somebody, or Danforth, for the comparative theology scholars, one generation after another. At one of those meetings, I guess the scholars being brought into this discussion said, our students can't go this way anymore. They're not interested in, say, taking, quote, my tradition and comparing it to somebody else's tradition. That is not relevant to them. And TWW is relevant. We've got to work it out, and there are many ways it can be done. So it's got an uncertain future. And I've always see my role as kind of providing a framework or something. It's kind of just chairing meetings, is put the idea forth, which can then be done. The only rule is don't stop at the borders of your confession. Take things in that are beyond your confession, either from other religions or indeed from philosophy, literature, science, wherever you find it, take it into your thought. And I think that's a project with tremendous potency, and it's on the right subject from my point of view. We're not trying to figure out these religions, which, all of us at a quiet moment, and no, that's a rather reified concept, the religions. Yet that's how we do our textbooks. That's how we organize our courses. There are obvious efficiencies in that. And it's not a completely made up, irrelevant category. Nevertheless, we all know the religions are porous. And so why treat them as if they're not? And especially why treat one's theological thinking as if these were not porous?
Thanks.
Jerry, I have a question for you. How are we different from things like process theology? There have been, other than Charles Hartshorne's initial initiation of process philosophy as process theology, you have so much development since then, not to mention John Cobb and my teachers at Claremont. But beyond that, there's Buddhist process, Jain process, even Hindu process, which one of my professors had asked me to do, and I'm like, no. And the reason is that, process theology has the structure of Whiteheadian philosophy, but process thinkers have taken it and run with it. So that's one question. I'm sure you can answer that very easily, but
let me just answer one at a time, if you don't mind, because otherwise I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
It was interesting when I spoke at Claremont Theological School, whatever they call it. The great John Cobb was there, and it turns out we were both crucially influenced by the same teacher, Richard McKeon at Chicago. But anyway, as soon as at the end of my talk about TWW, he said, I agree with 98% of what you said. And he's a hard grader, so I thought, well, that's pretty good. And what he disagreed with, which is he felt you needed something like a church. You need an organized community, not just to go off, theologizing. And I told him that was an issue I had not addressed and that needs to be addressed. So I'm completely sympathetic with that caveat. However, I wouldn't agree that Theology Without Walls is Whiteheadian in any unique sense. There are many ways it can be done. Process theology is a particular theology, whereas Theology Without Walls is a kind of field or subfield, a kind of, and it's not committed to a particular metaphysics, for example. I think the leading contributors rather vary. Often they're influenced by process thought, but I know Robert Neville's thinking really was formed before process theology had the big role it has now, and it proceeds from his own metaphysics, his own metaphysical intuitions, and then his encyclopedic capacity to understand the religions, to keep them in mind, and plus his belief in semiotics, the power of religious symbols to reach the ultimate. Well, that's not quite how Whitehead goes about it, right? Or this or that process theologian. So I would think it would fit very comfortably with it, certainly Without Walls. I mean, that's what one sees with them. They're not just trying to give you a version of Christian theology, although they usually start from there, though Jeffrey Long, I think, was in some ways incubated in that tradition. So it doesn't have to be that starting point, and maybe that's your story too, Rita. I don't know, but that's the difference. It is a particular theology, and theology without walls is wide open. And I've always tried, as kind of presiding officer of the thing, not to put a big thumb on the scales. You can do the scientific stuff the way Wesley Wildman does. He has that expertise. I don't. I couldn't even do it, what he does, and that's fine. And there are others doing different things that are equally relevant.
So Jerry, let me be the devil's advocate for a second.
Yes.
So I was asked to give a paper, I think it was Pacific Association of Theology, something like that. And it was an honor of John Cobb. And I was asked by Ted Peters to give a paper. And because I was, you know how life is, I didn't have time. So I just took, I'm a theologian, I'm a Hindu theologian. I'm a theologian of a branch of Hinduism, the Shakta theology, the theology of the divine feminine. She's both transcendent and immanent and the supreme divine. And she's not female. She's both and transcends either and is ultimately formless. It's very complex, very broad, very inclusive. I took it and I just put it in process categories because it fits.
Yes.
Now, all of it doesn't fit in process, but enough of it fits in process so that I could present it just as such without, it's not process. It's 4,000 years old. So I present this and John Cobb comes to me at the end of the session and says, you know, that is the most processy theology I've ever heard, rooted in another tradition. And could you write that up as a process theology for this thing? And I didn't have time. I said I couldn't, but I didn't want to say the truth, which is I just took the direct theology with no construction, and part of it fits in the process framework. So like this, theology without walls is so broad that process could fit inside it.
Sure. Yeah, it can fit inside anything except, well, it can fit inside a purely denominational theology as well. You can have a process understanding of it.
Open and relational theology and all of these other projects, I feel like theology without walls is so vast. All of these could fit inside theology without walls, but theology without walls could not fit inside any of them because it's too vast. Am I correct?
Yeah, well, it's not, and I wouldn't put it in terms of size so much as the sort of thing it is. Those are particular theologies or theological approaches or methodologies, whereas theology without walls, as I say, is a field or subfield, much as comparative theology is. You could do comparative theology, you can do process comparative theology, you can do relational comparative theology, you can do many other kinds of comparative theology. One's much more strongly confession-based or tradition-based, but it's an alternative way of defining the theological project that is then happens to be quite open to these recent developments. This would relate to the question Chris Denny asked, what chance do we have to be influential? Well, as I take it, these things that are theology beyond the walls, let's say, are already influential. So there it is. We see it happening before our very eyes, as are other things that are without walls. A lot of liberation theology without walls. It goes across the traditions, but it's a particular point of view. And feminist theology and this or that variant is without walls normally. It goes across the traditions and does a similar thing with one as with the next. And so on. There are just, and the scientific approaches, think of Philip Clayton or someone like that. I guess it's probably close to Whitehead. I don't know how identified he is with Whitehead, but it's bringing in a kind of developmental view of the natural world and understanding that as having theological potency. and it's not owned by, it's not within the walls of one tradition rather than another.
Chris,
So, Jerry, you mentioned a couple questions ago, church, and
Yes,
I want to talk a little bit more about the institutional background here that you see Theology Without Walls operating in. Thus far, Theology Without Walls has been ensconced in the academic conference circuit. If you sort of look ahead, what sort of institutional settings do you think are amenable for the flourishing of TWW? Any particular venues that you think we need to move into? Where do you think this seed will find the best soil?
well, that's an interesting question, Chris. I heard John Thetominal give the keynote at a regional AAR several years ago, big day where we were almost snowed out of meeting, but he got there and I got there and he was talking to them all. And that's when I heard him use the, do we want to be coop chickens or free range? Because he's got these way to take these nice little ordinary analogies and bring the message home with some concreteness. But I could see there was a lot of resistance in the audience. And I thought if he were saying these things anywhere except an audience of theologians and religion scholars, everybody would be saying, yes, yes, yes. We want to be open. We want to take it all in. So part of the challenge that I see, I can't think of any better venue. Why am I coming to AAR? Where else would I have gone that you can have this kind of discussion? I looked at what the philosophers were doing first, because that was my home territory. And what the philosophers are doing, like Alston and Flanagan, they're following that image where they're doing Christian apologetics, using high-level analytic techniques to buttress various Christian positions. Well, that would be of no interest at all to me, or exploring Christian-type issues that become problematic under Christianity. Does God's foreknowledge mean you can't have freedom? And this kind of, paradoxes, dilemmas that come up once you try to philosophically work out some of the implications. So that was of no interest. I can't find anywhere. And one of the wonderful things about AAR, the people there are very much nicer than philosophers. When a philosopher gives a talk, everybody in the room is trying to refute them. That's what happens. Whereas the religion scholars and theologians understand, well, these are the things most important and sort of intimate to a person, and they don't trample all over each other. Even when I gave a talk, what was it called? Truth Matters at the Institute for Christian philosophy at University of Toronto. And what I did was take on Planninga. It had sponsors were Dutch Reformed people. There was a guy from Holland from a Dutch Reformed thing. Calvin College was one of the sponsors. And that was the orientation of this institute. And I thought, well, they're not going to like this, but I thought this might be a useful discussion to have. And I found that they were disagreeing, but completely courteous and not spurning or not saying, I'm not going to listen, that kind of response at all. And so that's a reason this is a good venue. And as I was saying, Chris, there is no reason in this world that religious studies, theology of this tradition or that, cannot open up and become more flexible. And that would be, if they're going to survive, they're going to become that way. And why shouldn't it be more like the little Pebble Hill church I spoke at, where what you're really trying to do is support one another in your spiritual journeys? Chris, you've written about Sheila Larson, who Bella talked about, who just has her own little theology, which she calls Sheilaism, her own little voice. And well, why shouldn't that be something you say, oh, Sheila, and you talk, and maybe you can learn something from Sheila, maybe she can learn something from other people in the congregation. One opening I would like to see, and I guess if I were a young man, if I were the age of either of you, maybe I would take it on, is to go to some of these foundations like Lilly and Templeton and Danforth and so on that are interested in religion and see if we could get them to change the subject to something like wisdom traditions. Wisdom traditions is more wide open. It reaches, of course, as a philosopher, Plato and Aristotle are just full of wisdom. A guy like Ben Song a Confucian coming from China, when he read Aristotle, he was writing, wow, this guy is really has a lot to tell us. And notice he's the one who actually first used the term theology. So, he's kind of discovering these things. Most of my religion colleagues, even though they're aware of those, probably studied them at some point. This is not, they don't see them as relevant to their theology. But there's so many other sources. I think the world's great literature, you want to know about a key topic for the different traditions is the human predicament. What is the human predicament? Well, and at the hands of our textbooks, you might say, we go through, well, this religion says it's this, and that religion says it's that. It's sin for the Christian and ignorance for the Hindu and suffering, I guess, for the Buddhist. And then here's each one they have a solution to. But if you want to study the human predicament and really understand its ramifications, multiple forms, is there one predicament or is there many? Then one of the things you'd want to do is go read the novelists. I know you, Chris, gave a very interesting paper in Greek tragedy, and you've written this tour de force about Hans Urs von Balthasar, and he did the same thing. He studied literature, ancient and modern, and saw it as theologically relevant, even though, as I take it, he was not what you'd call a theologian without walls. He was looking at it through his own lens as a very important Christian theologian. But that's fine. But if you do learn something there, I would think it ought to have some impact on your theology. Why would you say otherwise? I mean, you could have your theology interpret it. I've known a lot of cases like that where somebody who went to a Christian college and took literature courses said they saw each one as a kind of fall and redemption, kind of that sort of template. Okay, you can do that, and you probably uncover some insights doing that, but that's not the only way to learn from literature. So I just see there are all these rich sources, and when I talk about wisdom traditions, I don't mean something narrow, as if Confucius didn't know anything else except his own tradition. They're not narrow. They knew many things, even ones as orthodox as you want to talk about, Augustine and Aquinas and the Christian tradition, know all kinds of things. And those things are relevant to their theologizing, to their thinking.
Thank you.
Okay.
So, Jerry, in agreement with your concern about the word religion, I've edited a volume with Arvind Sharma. I don't know if you're familiar with Arvind. The two of us edited a volume called Hermeneutics and Hindu Thought toward a fusion of horizons, from Gadamer's
Yes.
perceptive line. And so in that, Arvind has an article, which is really amazing. I think the title of it is The Hermeneutics of the Word Religion. And essentially what it means is the disastrous consequences of it.
Yes.
For Indian, quote, religions.
Yes.
Because even now, if you ask Hindus especially, 90% to 99% will say, we're not a religion. This is not a religion.
Right.
So angry with that, would hate the word. And I find it very useful because I'm a scholar of religion. So I find it very convenient, but they hate it. They hate it because of the colonial history, but not because of the colonial history, but because of what it did to the ecosystem of thought traditions and practice traditions
Yes.
on that massive subcontinent, which included everything. I mean, from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. And so that was history. That was 4,000 minimum years of history that is written, composed, where these traditions would constantly emerge, arise, and have mutual reciprocal illumination, to use our Sherma's beautiful terminology. And they would keep on like thanking each other and continue to learn from each other and keep moving, merging and separating. And that was just not considered a big deal. You have the Sanjiao Hei in China, the three wisdoms, you know, the Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist, and you did all of them. You were all of them, depending on what was going on in your life.
Yes.
And this was normative across Asia. All massive traditions would arise, not just local, massive, which are all now global. They'd arise, they'd inform each other, they'd be friends, everybody would be plural religious identities, and it just kept going. And then the British came, and the French came, and the Dutch came, and it ruined everything. And so there's a hatred for this word across Asia, and I'm very scared to use it, but it's a very useful heuristic for scholars.
Yeah, we need some label.
We need
So
something.
that,
We need
you know,
something.
even if it's a poor label, we need
it because we need to study. And the thing is, what people don't understand when they think religion, they think sacred texts, prophets, this, that. But that's not true, because we all know that religious, it's the study of religion, and also theology today is multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and even transdisciplinary.
Yes, yes.
And so you can't hate a word because of what it meant 200 years ago, because that has altered, changed, transformed itself. And so I think it's a useful heuristic. And this is kind of a thought that my question to you is based on, is that, you know, Unitarian Universalists, also New Thought people, the Unity Church, in which I was like a lay pastor, all of these places hate the word religion and what it implies to them. It despise it, okay? And then Unitarians have this whole build your own theology thing, okay?
Okay.
I taught courses in that. Now, the thing is this is the problem. When you look at Christianity, 3 branches or 4, massive 2,000 years of tradition, reception history, Islam, Hindu, all of these massive global traditions, you see so much thought going into, as you said, the human condition, the human predicament, but also the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, the nature of understanding, of knowledge, all manner of things. From these traditions, whatever we call them, arises poetry, literature, art, architecture, food, festivals, ethics. I could just go on and waste the whole day. But this is the value of these traditions. Do we need to look, while we build a boxless arena, what I call being at the beach? I'm in California, you have to excuse me.
Yes.
But at the same time, do we keep on seeking to build bridges into the boxes so that they have an ability to connect that brilliant and incredible resource going back thousands of years with what we're talking about today, which is this explosion of knowledge?
Yes,
and how do we do that?
Yeah, I sometimes find myself in these contexts where people start deriding religions. We should just get rid of them, as if that's the enemy, and I find myself defending the religions. I mean, if it weren't for the religions, we wouldn't know any of this. We wouldn't have the records of revelations, enlightenments, epiphanies, these remarkable lives that are iconic for us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The rituals that are can be so meaningful, even, you know, reaching broadly, you know, the understanding of food and what it is to open a business, you know, such that you're trying to serve something a little higher than cha-ching, you know, registering something at the cash register. All of those understandings have been preserved by the religions. And I know Paul Tillich makes the point that the religion needs priests as well as prophets. It needs prophets because priests start mistaking what they do for the ultimate, but you need them. And the prophets can't sustain an institution. And I guess in this context, I'm a prophet. I can't sustain any institution. I'm not in that role, and probably don't have those talents. Whatever talents I have, they're probably not quite in that direction. So you need some people to sustain the institutions, the understanding. And I always feel it's comparative theology is too narrow because it thinks the subject matter is the religions. And so it's really a branch of the theology of religions, which is a branch of confessional theology. What are we in our tradition to make of those other traditions? However, where else would one begin? You would begin by looking at the great, even if you're moving beyond the walls, you would start by learning what you can learn from the various encampments, let's say, within the walls, from the various civilizations and traditions and institutions and texts that are available, because they're a rich mother lode, even though we now need to do something with them different from what was done traditionally, maybe.
Jerry, I want to ask about this issue of tradition as it pertains to TWW. And it has to do with the question I posed to you in my list. So time's going to go on, right? And with it, hopefully TWW. So if TWW is not to wind up in the same boat, maybe not a few thousand years from now, but let's say a couple of decades from now, presumably it will be open to change. So as a retrospective question, are there any particular ways that you have seen TWW change since you inaugurated this project? And if so, how?
The change I'm seeing is, as I say, mainly in the younger people, but not only that. Of course, I see the people who come to TWW, and you wonder, why is Schmidt-Lukl coming to TWW rather than just doing comparative theology? He's great at that, has all the equipment and smarts and knowledge and so forth. Why isn't he just doing that? And that's because he and others, I've asked Mark Heim.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Heim is a kind of sophisticated exclusivist. He thinks each religion gives you a kind of salvation. It gives you what it promises, but Christianity is more comprehensive. And because of the Trinity, it's got all the bases covered. I'm sorry, this is a rather crude restatement of Mark Heim's position, and he uses the analogy of the Divine Comedy. In the Inferno, the lovers get love. They go on from all eternity in a kind of lovers chase after each other. And of course, at the highest levels of the Inferno here are Aristotle, and of course, Virgil is a guide through the Inferno, but they can't go on to the next level. So that's the problem they have. But they get all the wisdom that their philosophy and poetry promised. They get it. They've got it. But there's more, is Dante's point. There's something more. And Christianity, he argues, has it all. And that's a process that I think is very valuable. What he's doing is not just asserting his own membership in a tradition and my way or the highway, but he's arguing. And you can argue back. I think one of the limitations so far in our interreligious relations, it shows it's not yet mature because we have to tiptoe around each other. That's totally understandable at this point. The diplomacy and respect is crucial. However, in the end, you don't have a lively enterprise unless you can say to someone, this is why I'm a process theologian, let's say, and why I don't agree with you. This is why I'm whatever I identify as, and I don't agree with you. I don't agree with Mark Heim or this person or that person with his idea that the Trinity has got it all. But I'd have to give an argument. I couldn't just say, I don't buy it. I'd have to give an argument. And then he would give a counter argument, and then that would be a mature intellectual enterprise. I'm not sure I didn't lose the thread of your question, Chris. If I did, please restate it.
No, I mean, I think it was very interesting that you spoke in terms of the audience of TWW as being one sort of way in which you've seen the movement change, which I think
Yes.
is quite understandable given the fact that we've gone from an experience in prayer to now a communal setting that will continue to evolve.
Oh yeah, and I'm very aware
Mhm.
that my thinking is very American, shaped by my own Protestant upbringing, so that early on, I just getting to know Clooney, I did crossed a tripwire, not knowing what Catholics were sensitive to, and he stalked out of the room angry. And some
Wow.
people say, Frank Clooney angry. you can't even picture it. but I had said something. He said, "You're saying this to a Catholic," and so
Mhm.
I had kind of violated the integrity of his point of view in some way. And I've learned more what the sensitivities are. You have to know that dealing with any group. And coming from outside the religion business, I had to learn these sensitivities and protocols and so forth. But what I'm seeing with some of the younger people, and well, we haven't quite made it public yet because it's still very much in process, but the new publishing series, the new TWW publishing series, we're trying to get 5 books out in the fall, and as you know, founding essays is the one the two of you are putting together, and that seemed like the place to begin.
Mhm.
Those were the very initial ones before the volume by Rutledge was ever put out. This is where it started, and I did the volume, in fact, because the Tominal said, looking at these journals, hey, this is a treasure trove. And I thought, well, I didn't quite know if we'd gotten to that point, but maybe it's time to put a hardcover, you might say, out there as a more official statement or something. And we did that. But I think these initial volumes will none of them, other than some essays in the founding essays, none of these new volumes resemble comparative theology.
Mm.
And I think that will be illuminating for people, because in our community, it's very hard to imagine any other way of stepping beyond boundaries is to faithfully compare. That's the name of an anthology by someone. Faithfully compare one with another. But this is, and I was aware of this from the beginning. Confessional theology, because transreligious theology is inevitable, doesn't mean it's possible, because we know how to do confessional theology. And so we've got to learn how to do transreligious theology. And I think we are learning. But I always envisioned it wouldn't be declared up front, with a pre-existing methodology. We would learn it by trying this, trying that, and slowly refine our understandings and probably eventually have more of an understanding. But there is a community. May not be a church. But Clooney said this, even doing theology with doing the kind of comparative theology he does, puts him at some distance sometimes from his Catholic colleagues. But he says, meanwhile, and maybe with some friction there, but meanwhile, you kind of gain new colleagues, and there's another community that forms. And comparative theology is a kind of community of scholars itself. And that's very natural in the academic environment and has these enormous advantages that it can prove by its scholarship that it's really talking about something. And TWW being brand new and not having pre-existing models, it can be a little hard to know, well, how do you prove that this can actually come up with something? And I think we will start doing that as we move forward. I see Rita's had to step away. Is there a final question? Well, Rita's back. I'm not hearing you.
I was just protecting my bandwidth. It's
Okay.
back to normal now. Jerry,
Okay.
I think that was incredibly helpful, but I want to take us back to the concept of a congregation, because I think that you have New Thought Movement churches, you have Unity churches, you have UU churches, and there's many others, but this just comes straight to mind. Okay? And these are essentially congregations without a theological rubric. No, we're not giving them a theology. We're giving them a process, an approach, and a rubric. And I think, having worked with many of these congregations myself, I find that without frameworks and rubrics, it's hard to have any depth to the conversation or even personal experience. One of the things we mustn't forget that the traditions, all of them, provide us is with methodology for accessing the epistemology of mystical realization.
Mhm.
And this is not that people just don't accidentally fall into these states. There's an entire process. There's a training. You know, these are valuable. And they've come down to us now in the 21st century. Every, city has centers for meditation, mindfulness, this and that. These are very important resources that are being accessed by these congregations without theological rubrics, but without at least a rubric, at least a path, at least a direction. We're headed north, east, west, south, where? That kind of method leads you nowhere, because you can't even interpret your own experience with any kind of logic or reason. So I'm leaving that on your lap.
Okay, well, that's something, as I say, it's a work in progress. I said the very first time I ever talked about TWW, which now goes back, I don't know what year it was, 2014, maybe, about 10 years. I said, we'll learn the methods as we go along, because we don't have them up front. It's not like Descartes come whip out, some method that's the right method. Or a lot of the teachers, they give you a method. Well, that's fine, but there are many methods. And the question in a congregation is, what can we collectively as a community do? What concepts are available? Not just necessarily methods in the sense of how to reason from one thing to the next or how to relate ideas, but just as concepts for describing our experience. How can we come to understand it, to articulate it, our insights? And how can we then talk? We got to have a common language. And that was one of the first TWW panels we ever had. But it was the first panel, so you don't have final answers there. So that may be frustrating for people, but I sometimes feel, if you compare it to the history of Western thought, we're sort of in the Renaissance. If you go back to the Renaissance, you find ideas running all over the place. The Neoplatonisms and magical things, mages and so on, and the beginnings of modern science, atomists and biologists leading to, and there were still Aristotelians around, but it was nevertheless, a guy named Petrus Ramus wrote his dissertation, everything that Aristotle said is false. So you had this kind of intellectually iconoclastic move. But then that led, within a few hundred years, to views that were highly articulate and a variety of views that was somewhat systematic. And those weren't the only ones, but an awful lot happened there, in those periods. So they move forward, and that's just how these things are. You don't expect something simple. You can get something simple. The logical positivist, you think philosophy, the logical positivist had something very simple. If you can't prove it by observation, it's meaningless. So throw it out. Well, and David Hume said something similar to that. If it's committed to the flames, he said, if it's got these metaphysical propositions. Well, we're not going to do that. We're going to deal with the messy reality that is the intersection of human life, human culture, our lives with each other, and the thought world, our intellectual traditions, our religious traditions, worship traditions, rituals, the whole shebang of our institutional lives. And they're all interacting in a dynamic way. And I would take it that different members of the TWW community would be engaged in their own explorations of how one sorts these things out. Because you're right, Rita, you can't just leave them as a kind of tossed salad in the air. At least that's not the maximally helpful thing. And I take it what theology is always seeking is, in some sense, an articulate understanding. Even saying something is ineffable is itself an articulation of an articulate understanding of what that reality is. And so that's what we seek, and that's the excitement. These founding essays are the first forays, and they go in a number of ways. I guess I think maybe they're all kind of promising. I can't think of any one where I thought, oh, that was really wrong-headed, or a dead end, something like that. They were all exploring something quite real and making a real contribution to our effort to move forward together, because that's a collective conversation. And that's why I'm appreciative of American Academy of Religion, because it hosts these meetings. Where else could I have gone with this concept? But here, you do have a kind of a community, people brought together with a lot of shared background, a lot of shared sensibility, and a lot of shared goodwill for one another.